everyone is looking at in terms of expectations, there's kind of been a little bit of a debate between what the local media is saying and the national media. The national media has a lower expectation for the Detroit Lions. A lot of people locally and the fans kind of believe this is around a 7 to 8 win football team. What do you think is the fairest way to assess the Detroit Lions? Because there does seem to be increased talent across the board, but there also seems to be some question marks in terms of the high-end talent on the Detroit Lions roster. Is it fair to start around 8-8 for this team?
Yeah, I think that's a start. Sure. I mean, let's face it, every team in the league, because of the way the NFL is in the draft, they are, they're kind of wired. Every team is going to be 8-8. That's what they want. They want parity. And the difference between 8-8 and 9-7 or even 10-6 is a blown call here, a drop pass here, a holding call there, an interference call here. I mean, that literally is how close it is. To being a 10-6 and an 8-8 team. But the key for the Lions, though, is injuries. I don't think you can lose a Kerryon Johnson. I don't think you can lose a Darius Slay. Certainly Matthew Stafford, you've got to keep him healthy all year long. Those things will determine in many ways, how the Lions do. But overall, yeah, I think there's an upgrade in talent overall. But I think, again, the national media is not just looking at the Detroit Lions. They're looking at a division with Aaron Rodgers and Green Bay and a healthy Aaron Rodgers, and a division with Chicago, who seems to be on the uptick, if you will, with Trubisky at quarterback, and a division with one of the best defenses in the league in Minnesota. And you've got to play those teams 6 times out of your 16 games. So that divisional thing, I think, is where the national media looks and says, can the Lions compete on a even keel basis and get 5 wins or 4 wins out of those 6 games? And I think the national media says, no, that's not going to happen. And that to me is why the Lions aren't getting the shake from the national media that they are locally. And I would look at the local guys and say, you've got to look at that and say, can they compete in their division for the championship? Because ultimately you'd love to, you've almost, in this division, you almost have to win the championship, because then you get a home playoff game. And I think the Lions going on the road for the playoffs, as much as I'd love to say they're going to go get to the playoffs, that would be great. But to win one, because that's what this town really wants. They're absolutely, dying to get a playoff win. And once they do that, then I think they're kind of over the hump. But getting a playoff win will be a whole lot easier at Ford Field than it would be on the road. And that means you got to win the division, which means you got to beat Minnesota, Green Bay, and Chicago. That's a tall order.
Now, you've had an opportunity to watch and evaluate Matthew Stafford for almost a decade, being that you did color commentary for the Detroit Lions. Now he's entering into year 11. Obviously, he's criticized. He's definitely a polarizing figure. Now, entering into year 11, working with Darrell Bevell, where do you see his fit in terms of what he can do now for the Detroit Lions? Is it time for him? Or do you say, what? The offense with, an increased running game with tight ends, and now with increased talent on defense, maybe now the team is taking a better shape to allow his skill set to take form?
I think that's accurate. He's never done nothing to prove anything to me. This guy, in my opinion, is an elite quarterback. The only thing that he does not have on his resume are playoff appearances and playoff wins. That's it. He doesn't need to prove to me that he is as good a quarterback as this franchise has ever had. He can throw the ball. He can lead them. If they put a defense out there with him, for instance, if Matthew Stafford had the team of the 90s with Herman Moore, Brett Perriman, Barry Sanders, some of those tight ends, and the defense that team had with Benny Blades and Jerry Ball and Chris Spielman and those guys, that team's a perennial. I'm talking perennial playoff contender and may have gotten to a Super Bowl if Matthew Stafford is inserted into those teams. He just hasn't had that in Detroit since he's been here. And it's been a struggle. But from a quarterback standpoint and his ability to do, I don't care what offense he's in. When you're an offensive coordinator, you take a look at that guy, you take a look at his toughness, you take a look at what that right arm can do. If you're an offensive coordinator, I don't care what system you're in, you're going to take advantage of that. I've said this for years, up until, I was doing the games up until last season. The most dangerous offensive weapon the Lions have in their arsenal on that offense is the right arm of Matthew Stafford, period. and it still remains that way.
Now, I've enjoyed listening to a lot of podcasts, and now you are hosting a podcast. You can find it at thebrandyshow.com. This week, you had an in-depth conversation with Mike O'Hara. Give our listeners some highlights of that conversation. It was a great listen, hearing stories of the time. Both you and him have extensive experience with the Lions. It was a great listen. Share with my audience some of the highlights of this week's episode with Hall of Fame reporter Mike O'Hara.
Well, I appreciate that. We had a great talk, and I think the highlight to me is that I asked him, I said, why do you think the Lions, the question every Lions fans ask, John, is why haven't the Lions made the playoffs? Why haven't the Lions won a Super Bowl since 1957? Why haven't they won a championship? And his answer has been, I think pretty much echoed by a lot of people, is they have never had that trigger man. They've never had the quarterback. He believes that if in the 90s they had a great shot with the Herman Moore, that group. And I think that was a telling thing. I thought it was also telling, he back. And the other thing I thought was cool was when, the Joey Harrington, he said Joey just didn't have the heart to play. I mean, Mike was very honest and straightforward in the interview. We go back to the days of Russ Thomas and Matt Millen and discuss all those things. If you're a Lions fan and you've had these same questions and you've gone to the games and you've sat there and been frustrated, Mike has watched it all, and he kind of puts it in perspective, going through the years, talking about the players, the managers, and talking about Mr. Ford and his ownership, and whether that was the problem, which I don't think it is, and neither does Mike. But I think for Lions fans, it's an interesting perspective from a guy that has been very, very close to the franchise for over 40 years. And why the things that have happened to that franchise happened and why they haven't gotten to the mountaintop as many of us had hoped they would. So I think it's pretty interesting and pretty entertaining radio.
Yes, make sure you find it, thebrandyshow.com. Thank you so much for talking Detroit Lions. I look forward to having a conversation, maybe a midway point in the season, and when we get a chance to fully evaluate what's going on with the Detroit Lions. Jim Brandstatter, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast.
Good to be with you, John. Be well.